The silence of deep space was absolute, a darkness so complete it seemed endless. The UHS Nightfall, a long-range reconnaissance vessel, drifted through the void, its hull barely reflecting the distant starlight. Inside the command deck, a dim glow from the consoles cast long shadows as the crew monitored their systems, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. They were weeks into their survey mission, charting regions of unclaimed space, logging asteroid fields, and scanning for anomalies. It was routine. Until the signal came. At first, it was just a blip, an almost imperceptible fluctuation in the ship's deep space scanners. Faint, erratic, static-filled. But something about it didn't sit right. The crew had seen their share of cosmic interference, rogue radio bursts, and decaying satellite transmissions, but this was different. It had structure. It had a pattern. The lead communications officer adjusted the filters, isolating the frequency. The sound that followed sent a shiver through the room. A distorted, garbled voice, human, but not quite. Words flickered in and out, syllables stretching unnaturally, as if time itself was warping the message. Then, buried beneath the noise, something else. A sound not made by human vocal cords. Captain Wyatt leaned forward, his brow furrowed as he listened. The voice repeated in an endless loop, its urgency undiminished by time. He had heard distress calls before, some genuine, some automated echoes of ships long gone, but this one carried a different weight. A strange, unshakable wrongness. "Do we have an origin point?" he asked, his voice steady. The navigation officer glanced at his readings, hesitating. "Barely. The signal's degraded, but it looks like it's coming from a derelict vessel. Unregistered. No known records of any ship in that region." The bridge fell into silence. An unregistered ship. That alone was troubling. Space was vast, but it was also meticulously logged by corporate and military interests alike. Ships didn't just disappear, at least, not without a trace. And yet, this one had. The captain exhaled, considering the options. How long has that signal been out there? Hard to say with the interference, but... The officer's voice trailed off as he adjusted the spectral decay filters. When he looked up, his face was pale. "Sir, this signal is at least 50 years old." That sent a ripple of unease through the crew. 50 years. A distress signal, looping endlessly in the void, waiting for someone to listen. Someone to find it. Could be a wreck, one of the officers offered, trying to break the tension. Old ship, long dead. Maybe an abandoned science vessel? Or worse, another muttered. A trap. Wyatt remained silent, his gaze locked on the signal display. He had been in command long enough to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. This wasn't normal. But turning away wasn't an option. Not yet. "Run a full scan," he ordered. "I want a visual." The ship's long-range sensors kicked in, sweeping the designated coordinates. After several agonizing moments, a shape emerged on the screen. The black ship. It hung in the darkness like a void within the void, its hull darker than space itself. No reflections, no running lights, no heat signatures. It was massive, far larger than any known human vessel of that era, yet eerily intact for something that had supposedly drifted, abandoned, for half a century. The bridge crew stared at the image, an unspoken tension settling over them. "Still no life signs?" Wyatt asked. "None," came the quiet reply. "No power signatures either. It's dead." But Wyatt wasn't so sure. Ships didn't send distress signals 50 years after being abandoned. Something was still active inside that hull. Something had to be. The crew waited for his decision. He could feel their unease. Hell, he shared it. Every rational instinct told him to turn the Nightfall around and leave this thing to drift in silence. But that wasn't how this worked. Not out here. Not in the uncharted dark. "Prep a boarding team," he said, voice calm but firm. "We're going in." No one spoke as they moved to obey. The black ship loomed in the distance, a silent enigma against the endless stars. And it was waiting for them. The crew moved quickly, though there was no sense of urgency, just the heavy silence of uncertainty pressing down on them. The boarding shuttle was prepped, weapons checked, and suits sealed. Even though scans showed no life signs, no one was taking chances. Space had a way of turning certainty into regret, and no one wanted to be caught off guard. Wyatt stood at the docking bay, watching his team gear up. They were the best. He had seasoned explorers, security specialists, and engineers who had seen their share of derelict ships. But this wasn't just another wreck. This was something else. "You all know the drill," he said, his voice steady. "Standard boarding protocol. We go in slow, we stay together, and we keep comms open at all times." A few nods, no words. Everyone felt it, the unspoken tension that came with stepping into the unknown. The shuttle detached from the nightfall, thrusters firing in controlled bursts as it drifted toward the black ship. Up close, the vessel seemed wrong in a way no camera feed could capture. Its hull absorbed light, almost like it was drinking in the darkness around it. No markings, no insignia, no signs of damage, just a smooth, seamless surface that stretched impossibly across the void. "Still no response to hails?" Wyatt asked through comms. "Nothing," came the reply. The shuttle latched onto what appeared to be an airlock, though it barely resembled standard human design. The metal had an organic quality, like it had been grown rather than constructed. The docking clamps engaged, and the outer doors hissed open. Inside, the air was still. The suit's internal scanners detected trace amounts of oxygen, but it was thin, stale, as if the ship itself had long since stopped breathing. Wyatt took the first step inside. His boots touched the deck, and a faint vibration pulsed beneath him, so subtle he wasn't sure if he actually felt it or if it was just his nerves. The corridor stretched ahead, walls smooth and featureless, except for the occasional unfamiliar markings. Not quite writing, not quite symbols. Just etchings that seemed to shift under the dim glow of their suit lights. The team advanced, weapons raised, but fingers off the triggers. No movement. No sound. Just the deep, endless silence that made space feel claustrophobic, even in the open corridors. "Check your scanners," Wyatt ordered. One of the engineers pulled out a handheld device, running a sweep of the area. The readings were off. Some sections of the ship registered as solid, others were uncertain, as if the material wasn't fully there. "Captain," the engineer said, voice tight. "This ship. It's got human components." Wyatt turned, frowning. "Explain." The engineer gestured to the wall paneling, tracing a gloved hand over the smooth metal. "Some of this structure, it's based on human manufacturing. The alloys match, the way these seams connect, but the rest of it, it's not. It's like someone took parts of a human ship and merged them into something else." Wyatt didn't like that. Not one bit. A lost vessel was one thing. A vessel that had been altered, somehow fused with an unknown technology. That was something else entirely. "Keep moving," he said. They pushed deeper into the ship, passing through more corridors that seemed to subtly change when they weren't looking. At first, it was just small details, a marking that seemed to be slightly different than before, a doorway that hadn't been there a second ago. Then they reached the crew quarters. Or what was left of them. Inside, rows of empty spacesuits stood upright, as if their occupants had simply vanished. The suits were intact, sealed, but there were no bodies inside. No signs of struggle, no blood, no decay. Just absence. One of the security officers stepped forward, reaching out cautiously. The moment their fingers brushed against a suit, it collapsed into dust, disintegrating in a whisper of particles. The others remained perfectly still. Wyatt swallowed. This ship had a crew. And they didn't leave. The engineer was still scanning, his face pale behind the visor. "Captain, I'm picking up something. Low-level energy readings deeper in the ship." Wyatt turned to the rest of the team. "We press on. Stay sharp." As they continued, the vibrations beneath their feet grew stronger. The ship wasn't just a wreck, it was reacting to them. Then, the lights flickered. Faint at first, barely noticeable, but enough to make the team freeze. The soft hum of energy began rippling through the walls, like a distant heartbeat. And then the comms crackled. The sound was faint, distorted. But it was a voice. It was speaking in fragments, a looped message that had been decayed by time and interference. But beneath the static, beneath the warped audio, Wyatt could make out 3 words. "Do not speak." The message repeated, growing slightly clearer each time. "Do not speak." Wyatt's blood ran cold. "Pull the logs," he ordered. "Check if that message matches the distress call." The tech specialist worked quickly, fingers moving over their scanner. When they looked up, there was fear in their eyes. "Sir, it's the same voice. The same signal." But they hesitated. "But what?" "It's coming from inside the ship." Wyatt felt the weight of those words settle over him. The distress signal wasn't a distant, automated loop from an abandoned ship. It was active. Present. And then, for the first time, something moved. Down the corridor, just at the edge of their lights, a shadow shifted. Not floating debris. Not a trick of the darkness. Something watching. Something waiting. Wyatt didn't blink. "Fall back," he said, voice low. "Now." But as they turned, the ship shifted. Corridors closed behind them, walls that had once been open were now sealed, reshaped in an instant. The ship was alive, and it had just made a decision. The hum of energy grew louder, pulsing through the walls, through their suits, through the very air around them. And then, a whisper. "Close." Right behind them. Not through comms. Not through scanners. Right there. A voice that wasn't theirs. "New arrivals logged." And the lights went out. Darkness swallowed them. The lights didn't just flicker and die, they were consumed, like the ship itself had willed them away. The team's helmet lamps cut through the black, but the beams seemed muted, as if the air itself was resisting their glow. Wyatt forced himself to breathe evenly. Panic was a death sentence in situations like this. "Check in," he said, keeping his voice measured, but his fingers had tightened around his weapon. One by one, the team responded. All accounted for. No one injured. But the tension in their voices was impossible to miss. "Try comms," Wyatt said. The tech specialist fumbled with the equipment, adjusting dials and frequencies. Still connected to the nightfall, but they stopped, swallowing hard. "But what?" Wyatt pressed. "It's too quiet." Comms weren't dead. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that no one was answering. Not even static. No background noise, no ship hum. Just emptiness. Wyatt clenched his jaw. "Keep trying." He turned his focus back to the corridor ahead. The ship had changed. When the lights went out, he was sure of it. The walls had shifted, closing off the path they had taken in. The ship was rearranging itself. A security officer exhaled sharply. "Captain, we shouldn't be here." Wyatt agreed. Every fiber of his being told him to get out. But how? The way back was gone. And even if they could retrace their steps, the ship wasn't letting them. A low rumbling sound vibrated through the floor. Not mechanical. Deeper. Alive. "We keep moving," Wyatt said. "Stay close." The team pressed forward, each step cautious. The corridor stretched into the unknown, its end lost in the haze of their dim lights. The air was thicker here, heavy with something unseen. Like walking through a place that remembered too much. Then, a new sound. A whisper. Not from their comms. Not an echo. A voice. Right there. A name. One of theirs. Spoken so softly it almost wasn't heard. Wyatt's blood ran cold. Who said that? No answer. The team looked at each other, shaken. Call out, Wyatt ordered. Now. The security officer closest to him hesitated before speaking. Identify yourself. Silence. Then the whisper returned. Closer. Behind them. The name again. Stretched. Twisted. Like a memory trying to be real. The officer spun, weapon raised, scanning the darkness. I don't like this, Captain. Neither did Wyatt. Then came a new sound. A footstep. Not theirs. Deliberate. Measured. It wasn't supposed to be possible. The ship was silent. No life signs. Nothing was supposed to be here. But something was. One of the engineers shuddered. Maybe it's a recording, he whispered. Some kind of. The whisper spoke again. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was all of theirs. Speaking at once. Repeating words they had just said. Mimicking. Distorted. Wrong. Wyatt tightened his grip on his weapon, forcing his breathing to stay even. Keep moving. Now. No one hesitated. They walked faster. The whispers followed. Then, abruptly, the corridor opened into a vast, circular chamber. The walls curved, impossibly smooth, yet somehow organic. Symbols, those same shifting etchings, covered every surface. In the center of the room stood something that didn't belong. A chair. No, not a chair. A command seat. And it was human-made. Wyatt's stomach twisted. It was old, its edges worn by time, its design familiar. This wasn't alien. This was from Earth. But how? The security officer moved closer, shining his light on the ground around it. Boot prints. Fresh. Wyatt stepped forward, swallowing the unease creeping up his spine. His fingers brushed the armrest of the seat, and instantly, a surge of static hit their comms. A voice. Clear this time. Human. Desperate. You shouldn't have come. The words were rushed, urgent, like someone barely holding on. Then, a sound that made Wyatt's blood freeze. A breath. Not from the comms. From the chair. The light flickered. Something shifted in the darkness beyond. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the eyes. Something waking up. The air in the chamber grew thick, pressing against their suits like an unseen force was watching, or worse, waiting. Wyatt kept his hand on the armrest, heart pounding as the breath from the chair faded into silence. The comms remained open, but no one spoke. Then, the whisper returned. Closer than ever. You shouldn't have come. It was the same voice. The same desperate warning. But now, it wasn't just through comms. It was in the room. The security officer raised his weapon, eyes darting across the dim chamber. Captain. Something's here. Wyatt felt it too. A pressure against his mind, like standing too close to an edge without knowing how far the drop was. The shadows in the room shifted, stretching just beyond the light of their visors. The symbols on the walls pulsed, as if they were breathing. Then the chair moved. It wasn't much. Just a slight tilt, a fraction of an inch. But it was enough. Enough to make them realize they weren't alone. One of the engineers stumbled back. "Captain, we need to leave. Now." Wyatt wasn't so sure they could. Not anymore. The shadows deepened at the far end of the chamber. Not natural darkness, something else. Something that felt wrong, like it had always been there but was only now revealing itself. A shape began to emerge. Not stepping forward. Not moving in any way that made sense. It just became visible. A figure. Tall. Motionless. Watching. It was human. Or at least, it looked that way. But its face. The engineer took a sharp breath. That's a flight suit. That's. The figure twitched. A glitch, a moment of disjointed motion, like a broken hologram trying to stabilize. Its visor reflected nothing. Then, in a voice that wasn't its own, it spoke. "Who's there?" Wyatt's stomach dropped. It had used his voice. Distorted. Echoing. But he's. The security officer took a step back, weapon shaking in his grip. "Captain, what the hell is that?" The figure twitched again. Its head tilted, slow, unnatural. The visor began to shift, the black glass melting away into something else, something that looked back. Not a face. Not eyes. Just the reflection of their own lights, swallowed by the void beneath. Then. The shadows moved. Not just in one place. Everywhere. Rushing through the corridors they had walked. Sealing off their escape. The comms crackled. Another voice. "Stay quiet." Not Wyatt's. Not the whisper from before. Someone else. Someone real. Then, the lights died completely. A split second of total blackness. And the sound of footsteps rushing toward them. The footsteps were too fast. Too many. Coming from every direction at once. Wyatt braced himself, gripping his weapon tighter, but he couldn't see a thing. The darkness wasn't just absence of light, it was something more, something that felt alive, shifting around them. He heard the security officer breathing heavily beside him, barely holding it together. The engineer muttered a curse, fumbling for his backup light. Then a flash. For the briefest moment, the chamber was illuminated. A flickering red emergency light somewhere deep within the ship surged back to life, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. And that's when Wyatt saw it. The figure was closer now, standing just a few feet away. It hadn't walked. Hadn't moved. It had just appeared. The flight suit was wrong. Not just old, but stitched together from different pieces, mismatched patches of fabric and armor plating. Some of it wasn't even human-made. The visor had fully melted away, revealing nothing inside. No face. No features. Just a deep, empty void, as if the inside of the suit was an open door into somewhere else. Wyatt's instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, it spoke again. "Who's there?" The exact same words. The exact same intonation Wyatt had used before. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was all of them. The figure was copying them, layering their own words on top of each other. Wyatt, the security officer, the engineer, every voice overlapping, perfectly mimicked, perfectly unnatural. The engineer let out a strangled sound. "Captain, we have to." The lights flickered again, and in that instant, the figure moved. Not walked. Not lunged. Just was suddenly there, inches from the engineer. Something reached out from inside the suit. Not a hand. Not anything human. The engineer screamed. Wyatt fired. The shot ripped through the figure, but it didn't react. No blood. No impact. The bullet passed through like it had been fired into an empty suit. But something shifted behind the fabric, something that writhed and twisted as if waking up. Then a second voice joined in. "Stay quiet." Not the whisper from before. Not the mimicry. This was the real voice they had heard over comms. Wyatt barely had time to register it before the floor dropped out beneath them. Gravity vanished. The entire chamber lurched as if the ship itself had been ripped away from reality, and suddenly, Wyatt was weightless, spinning in absolute darkness. The engineer was screaming. The security officer was shouting something Wyatt couldn't hear over the chaos. The only thing keeping them from drifting into oblivion was their magnetic boots, desperately clinging to the shifting floor. Then out of nowhere a hand grabbed Wyatt's arm. Real. Solid. Human. Someone pulled him back, yanking him toward something just outside the light. A face appeared. A real, human face. Unshaven. Hollow-eyed. Desperate. A survivor. One that wasn't supposed to be here. Wyatt barely had time to process it before the man shoved something into his hand. A data chip. Old, scratched, labeled with a designation Wyatt didn't recognize. The man's lips moved. No sound. Just a frantic, desperate plea. Then the light surged back on. The gravity returned. Wyatt crashed onto the floor, gasping for air. The engineer was still alive, shaking. The security officer was already scrambling to his feet, weapon raised. But the figure in the flight suit? Gone. And so was the survivor. Only the data chip in Wyatt's hand remained. And whatever was on it, something had just risked everything to get it to him. Wyatt's fingers clenched around the data chip, his pulse hammering. The chamber was silent now, too silent. No whispers. No shifting shadows. Just the distant hum of the ship's failing systems and the ragged breathing of his team. The engineer sat up, dazed, but alive. The security officer swept the area, weapon still raised. Wyatt knew what he was thinking. The figure, the flight suit, the thing inside it was gone. But that didn't mean it wasn't still watching. Wyatt forced himself to focus. The chip. The survivor had given it to him for a reason. He didn't have time to wonder how the man had vanished. The ship was changing, rewriting itself around them, and if they didn't move, they'd be trapped forever. "Can you read this?" he asked, tossing the chip to the engineer. The man caught it with shaking hands, still pale from the encounter. He fumbled with his wrist console, plugging the chip into the port. The screen flickered. A file loaded. Then, a video began to play. It was grainy, corrupted, but the voice was clear. "If you're seeing this, it means I failed." Wyatt's stomach tightened. The screen showed a man in a flight suit. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow with exhaustion. This ship isn't abandoned. It isn't derelict. It's infected. The security officer took a slow step closer, his grip tightening on his rifle. "It's alive," the man in the video continued. "It learns. It copies. And once you enter, it won't let you leave." The video glitched. The man's face twisted for a second, distorted by static. But when the feed stabilized, he was staring right at them. "You're already part of it now." The engineer swore under his breath. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Fast forward. The engineer hesitated, then scrubbed through the video. The footage jumped, cutting to the same man, but this time he looked worse, eyes sunken, skin pale, as if something had drained the life from him. "I tried to escape," he whispered, "but I kept waking up back here." The security officer cursed. "This isn't a distress signal. This is a warning." The video skipped again. The man was now crying. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on. It's taking me. Changing me. And if you hear me say anything else, if I talk to you, if I beg you for help, it's not me anymore." The screen glitched one last time. And then the man's face melted away, replaced by something else. The shape of him was still there. The flight suit. The helmet. But now, the figure was empty, just like the one they had seen in the chamber. A hollow shell, waiting to be filled. The recording cut to black. Wyatt's blood ran cold. The security officer took a sharp breath. "Captain. The survivor. The one who gave you the chip." Wyatt already knew. It had been him. The man in the video, the one warning them to get out, was the same man who had just grabbed Wyatt's arm. The same man who had vanished without a trace. But that wasn't possible. He had been alive. Solid. Real. Unless... The engineer suddenly gasped. "Sir. The timecode on this video." Wyatt didn't want to hear it. But the engineer said it anyway. This was recorded over 50 years ago. The chamber shuddered. The lights flickered. And the whisper returned. But this time, it was different. This time, it came from inside their comms. Wyatt's own voice. "Who's there?" The ship had learned them. Copied them. And now, it was them. The floor lurched, metal twisting beneath their boots. The walls shifted. Their exit route was gone. The security officer spun, panic flaring in his eyes. "Orders, Captain?" Wyatt's mind raced. There was one way out. One way to stop this from happening to anyone else. He reached for his wrist console, overrode the safety protocols, and started the self-destruct sequence. The ship screamed. Not an alarm. Something deeper. Something alive. The shadows lunged, but Wyatt and his team were already running, sprinting toward the docking bay, toward the last remaining escape pod. The whisper followed them. Their own voices echoed through the halls, calling to them. Pleading. "Stay. Don't leave. You're already part of us." Wyatt didn't stop. They reached the escape pod just as the ship began to collapse, metal twisting in on itself like something was pulling it apart from the inside. The moment they launched, the black ship disappeared from view, swallowed by the explosion that followed. The shockwave threw them into the void, tumbling toward open space, toward safety. The engineer let out a shaky breath. "We made it." Wyatt wasn't so sure. Because in the silence of the pod, in the dim glow of the emergency lights, something whispered through the comms one last time. His own voice. "Who's there?" Wyatt stared at the blinking comms console, his heart pounding, the silence around him deafening. He didn't need to hear the whisper again to know what it meant. The words, his own voice, creeping through the comms, sent a chill through his spine. "Who's there?" It wasn't the first time he'd heard it. But now, after everything, after the chaos they'd just escaped, it felt like a taunt. Like something was still waiting for them, still pursuing them. He rubbed his face, exhausted. His team was quiet. The engineer was staring at the pod's viewport, lost in thought, while the security officer clenched his fists in frustration. They had barely made it out. The self-destruct sequence had gone off just in time, tearing apart the black ship, but they didn't feel like survivors. They felt like victims. They had escaped, yes, but at what cost? "We made it," the security officer finally said, but there was no conviction in his voice. His eyes darted to Wyatt, as if he was waiting for some reassurance. But Wyatt didn't have any to give. The ship that had nearly consumed them was now destroyed. But had it truly been destroyed? Or was it still lurking somewhere in the dark, watching, waiting for them to slip up? "We're not safe yet," Wyatt said quietly, his voice hoarse. He couldn't stop thinking about the data chip, the message that had come with it, and the implications it held. The black ship was only part of this. Whatever it was, it's still out there. And we're still carrying it with us. The engineer turned to him, his eyes wide. What do you mean, Captain? Wyatt clenched his jaw. The voices we heard, it wasn't just the ship. It was something else, something inside it. Something that's been here far longer than any of us realized. And now it's here. In us. He stared at his team, searching for any signs of disbelief, but found none. They had seen too much. We've been marked, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever that thing was, it didn't just copy us. It became us. The pod hummed softly as it drifted through the void. They had left the remnants of the black ship behind, but the thought of what they had left in their wake lingered heavily in the air. The weight of unknown consequences pressed down on them. What had they just escaped? And what had they brought with them? The engineer swallowed, looking down at the console in front of him. If that's true, if it's inside us now, then we're all changing, Wyatt finished for him. He had thought about it for hours. The ship, the blackness that seemed to consume everything it touched, had done something to them. They had barely made it out, but there was no guarantee it wouldn't follow them. There was no guarantee that they hadn't been infected, and once something like that was inside, could it ever be gotten rid of? We need to get back to Earth, Wyatt said, his voice resolute. We need to get off this pod and get to the nearest station. We need to tell the authorities what happened. Warn them. But as he said it, he knew. He knew it wasn't that simple. They had no proof. The data chip was corrupted, the video footage too damaged to reveal anything concrete. There was nothing solid to back up their story. No one would believe them. They would be treated as if they were just another crew lost in space, returning from the dead with half-formed tales of madness. You're thinking of telling them, aren't you? The security officer asked, his voice flat. Wyatt didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The truth was, he didn't know what to do anymore. There was no guarantee the authorities would listen. They had seen the ship, they had felt its presence, but the evidence. The truth, as it stood now, was something only they could feel. Only they knew. But if they didn't act, then the cycle would never end. The black ship, the voices, the infection, it would all continue. It had to be stopped, and they had to be the ones to do it. We need to figure out how to stop it, Wyatt said, after a long pause. His gaze fixed on the engineer. This thing, whatever it is, we need to understand it. Before it does to others what it tried to do to us. The engineer nodded, his eyes hardening. I'll start going through the files, Captain. If there's anything left on the chip, anything we missed, it might be the key. Wyatt nodded. Good. Everyone stay sharp. We don't know what's really happened here. B. But as the crew got to work, Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. There was a presence in the pod now, something unseen, something close, almost suffocating. He turned sharply, scanning the shadows of the pod. His instinct screamed at him to be cautious. The whisper came again. Who's there? Wyatt's blood ran cold. He wasn't imagining it. It was real. That same voice, the one they'd heard before. The one that had come from inside the black ship, the one that had mimicked their own. This time, it was different. It wasn't the engineer's voice. It wasn't the security officer's. It was his own. Captain? The security officer's voice came from behind him, but Wyatt couldn't look away from the dark corner of the pod where the whisper had come from. A sound soft, almost imperceptible, echoed through the chamber. The voice spoke again, but this time, it was clear. We're already here, Captain. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but his body went cold when he saw the source of the voice. The engineer. But it wasn't him. Not anymore. Wyatt's heart stopped as the engineer's body twisted unnaturally, his face blurring before his eyes. The man's body was there, but his features were shifting, warping, like something was trying to force its way through. What's happening? The security officer gasped, backing away. But there was no time to react. The engineer's voice distorted, becoming unnatural, overlapping with Wyatt's own voice, the same words, the same tone, twisted together like a cacophony of sound and shadow. "We're already here." The figure in front of them began to shimmer. It flickered, a hollow form, and then it vanished. Only for a moment. And when the figure reappeared, it was standing in front of the viewport, staring out into the vast expanse of space. Wyatt felt his heart skip a beat. There was something so wrong about the sight, something he couldn't place. A presence. A shift in the air. Before he could react, the pod's emergency alert systems began to blare. The lights flashed. The pod jerked as if it was being pulled by an unseen force. "Get us out of here!" Wyatt shouted, rushing to the controls. But it was already too late. The pod was no longer in their control. It was being pulled into the darkness of space, toward something far larger. Something that shouldn't have existed. Something they couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, overlapping their own, until all they could hear was a single question. "Who's there?" And that question echoing in their minds would be the last thing they heard before everything went dark.